In 1815, Nathan Mayer Rothschild stood in the London Stock Exchange with information that would make him the wealthiest man in England within 24 hours. While the rest of Britain waited desperately for news from Waterloo, Rothschild already knew the outcome, and he was betting against his own country's victory to maximize his profit. This wasn't insider trading in the modern sense. This was the birth of a financial strategy that would reshape global power for the next 2 centuries. What Rothschild discovered that day wasn't just how to profit from war. It was how to ensure that wars, regardless of their outcome, would always benefit the same financial institutions. Over the next 200 years, this formula would be refined, replicated, and embedded so deeply into the international banking system that it would become invisible to most observers. The Rothschild formula operates on a principle that contradicts everything we're taught about conflict and competition. In a world where nations fight for supremacy, this banking dynasty discovered that the real power lies not in victory, but in financing both the victor and the vanquished. The mechanics are elegant in their simplicity. A government preparing for war needs immediate capital, far more than tax revenue can provide in the short term. Bonds become the solution, offering investors fixed returns in exchange for funding military operations. But here's the critical insight the Rothschilds understood. The more desperate a government becomes, the higher the interest rates they'll accept, and the more control they'll surrender over their financial sovereignty. The family's advantage came from 3 revolutionary innovations in 19th century finance. First, they established the fastest private intelligence network in Europe, using carrier pigeons, fast ships, and encrypted messages to know the outcome of major events before governments themselves. Second, they positioned a brother in each of Europe's major financial capitals, London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt, creating the first truly international banking operation. Third, they recognized that lending to both sides of a conflict eliminated the risk of backing the losing side while doubling the opportunity for profit and influence. This wasn't just about making money from war. This was about understanding that sovereign debt creates leverage over national policy that can persist for generations. When a nation's debt burden becomes unsustainable, the creditors don't just receive interest payments, they receive the power to influence tax policy, trade agreements, and even the decision to enter future conflicts. The Rothschilds didn't just finance wars. They created a system where war debt became the foundation of peacetime control. The story begins in 1798 when 24-year-old Nathan Mayer Rothschild left Frankfurt for Manchester, England, initially to trade textiles. Within 5 years, he had moved to London and shifted his focus entirely to merchant banking and government finance. By 1809, the British government faced an existential crisis. Napoleon controlled most of continental Europe, and Britain's economy was strained by the costs of subsidizing various coalitions against France. The Duke of Wellington's army in Portugal desperately needed funding, but transporting gold across a blockaded Europe seemed impossible. Nathan Rothschild proposed a solution that demonstrated the family's transnational advantage. Using his brother James in Paris and his brother Karl in Naples, Nathan created a clandestine financial network that moved British gold through France itself, enemy territory, to pay Wellington's troops. He purchased gold in London, had it shipped to Paris through neutral intermediaries, converted it to local currencies through his family network, and delivered it to Wellington in Portugal. The British government paid a premium for this service, but Rothschild's real profit came from the currency exchanges and the inside knowledge he gained about military movements and government solvency. By 1815, the Rothschild Bank had become indispensable to the British war effort. The Waterloo moment arrived on June 18, 1815. The battle would determine Europe's fate, and financial markets across the continent waited in suspended animation. Nathan Rothschild's agent, Rothworth, watched the battle and immediately departed for the English Channel, arriving in London a full day before the official government courier. The legend says Rothschild began selling British consols, government bonds, leading other traders to assume Britain had lost. As panic selling drove prices to rock bottom, Rothschild's agents secretly bought massive quantities of bonds at depressed prices. When news of Wellington's victory arrived the next day, those bonds skyrocketed in value, and Rothschild's wealth increased by approximately 20 times his initial investment. Whether this exact sequence occurred or is embellished by history, the documented fact remains. Nathan Rothschild emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as Britain's preeminent banker, with unprecedented access to government borrowing at both the British and Austrian treasuries. By 1818, the Rothschild Bank coordinated a $5 million loan to Prussia, and by 1822 they arranged loans to Austria, Russia, and Naples simultaneously. The family had established the template. They weren't tied to any single nation's success. They financed the system itself. Throughout the 19th century, the Rothschild formula expanded beyond European conflicts to infrastructure projects, colonial ventures, and the industrialization of warfare itself. The family financed the British acquisition of the Suez Canal in 1875, lending Prime Minister Disraeli $4 million with just 24 hours' notice, a transaction that gave Britain control over the fastest route to India, and dramatically shifted the balance of imperial power. The genius lay in understanding that peacetime investments created the conditions for future conflicts that would require additional financing. Railroads, for instance, weren't just commercial ventures, they were military assets that allowed for rapid troop deployment. The Rothschilds financed railway construction across Europe and in emerging markets, knowing that these networks increased the likelihood and scale of future wars. In the American context, the family played both sides differently, but just as profitably. While the London branch maintained relationships with the Union government during the Civil War, the French branch provided capital to Confederate cotton traders. The family didn't fund the Confederate military directly. That would have been too politically risky for their British interests, but they ensured their capital flowed to both sides of America's bloodiest conflict through commercial channels. By the 1870s, this approach had evolved into what historians call bond diplomacy. The Rothschilds and other major banking houses could effectively veto military conflicts by refusing to underwrite war bonds, or they could encourage conflicts by offering favorable terms. When Italy unified under Cavour in the 1860s, Rothschild financing was essential to paying for the military campaigns. When Germany unified under Bismarck following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, the 5 billion franc indemnity France paid to Germany was largely financed through Rothschild-coordinated bonds, meaning the family profited from France's defeat by financing both France's payment and Germany's receipt of that payment. The pre-World War I era represented the peak of this system. By 1914, the Rothschild family and their associated banking networks had helped finance the military buildups of Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, all of the major powers that would soon slaughter each other's citizens in industrial-scale warfare. The July crisis of 1914 showed the limits of bond diplomacy. Financial interests could no longer prevent a war that decades of competitive financing had made inevitable. But it also showed the formula's resilience. Regardless of which empires fell, the debt would survive, and creditors would be repaid by whoever remained standing. World War I changed the scale, but not the fundamental principle. The conflict cost approximately $334 billion in 1914 dollars, roughly $9 trillion in today's money. Britain borrowed $1.34 billion from the United States alone, creating a debt relationship that would reshape the Anglo-American financial architecture. The Rothschild family's direct influence began to diffuse during this period, not because the formula failed, but because it succeeded so completely that other institutions adopted it. J.P. Morgan became the primary American coordinator of war financing, arranging over $3 billion in loans and supplies to Britain and France between 1914 and 1917. When America entered the war, Morgan helped coordinate the Liberty Bonds program, which raised $21.5 billion from American citizens. The formula had evolved. Rather than one family financing both sides, the international banking system as a whole now performed this function, with different institutions dominant in different geographies, but all following the same fundamental principle. The interwar period demonstrated another crucial element of the formula, Reconstruction debt. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 restructured German reparations payments, with American banks lending Germany the money to pay Britain and France, who then used those payments to repay war debts to the United States. This circular debt structure generated fees and interest at every stage for the banking institutions that coordinated it, even as it created the economic instability that would contribute to the Great Depression and the rise of fascism. World War II reached a new magnitude, approximately $4 trillion in 1940s dollars, roughly $60 trillion in current terms. The United States emerged as the dominant creditor nation, having financed both its own war effort and supported allies through Lend-Lease programs that distributed $50.1 billion in aid. The post-war Bretton Woods system institutionalized American financial dominance, with the dollar becoming the global reserve currency backed by gold. This wasn't a Rothschild system anymore. It was a nationalized version of their formula, with the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve playing the role the family had once played in Europe. The Cold War represented the formula's ultimate evolution. From 1945 to 1991, both superpowers borrowed enormous sums to finance military buildups that never resulted in direct conflict. The United States spent approximately $8 trillion on Cold War military expenditures, financed largely through Treasury bonds. The Soviet Union bankrupted itself trying to keep pace, ultimately collapsing under a military burden its economy couldn't sustain while facing an opponent who could simply borrow more from global capital markets. Today's version of the Rothschild formula operates through sovereign debt markets worth over $70 trillion globally. The United States federal debt exceeds $36 trillion as of 2024, with annual interest payments surpassing $1 trillion for the first time in history. This isn't primarily war debt anymore. It's the debt of a permanent military-industrial economy where the distinction between wartime and peacetime has dissolved. Consider the mechanics of modern U.S. military financing. The Pentagon's base budget for fiscal year 2024 was $842 billion, but this excludes nuclear weapons programs housed in the Energy Department, Veteran Affairs costs, and intelligence agencies, bringing the total national security spending to approximately $1.4 trillion annually. None of this is paid for with current tax revenue. Instead, the Treasury Department auctions bonds to domestic and international investors, with the largest foreign holders being Japan, $1.1 trillion, and China, $850 billion. These creditor nations, who are also major U.S. trading partners and potential strategic rivals, now have financial stakes in American solvency that complicate any geopolitical confrontation. The Rothschild formula has become embedded in the structure of globalized finance. When the United States increases military spending to counter China in the Pacific, it does so partly with borrowed Chinese capital. When European nations increase defense budgets in response to Russian aggression, they issue bonds purchased by a global investor base that includes Russian oligarchs' offshore wealth. The formula now operates automatically through market mechanisms rather than through individual banking dynasties. The Ukraine conflict illustrates this perfectly. The United States has appropriated over $113 billion in aid to Ukraine as of late 2024, financed entirely through additional borrowing. The European Union has committed approximately $88 billion, also financed through bond issuance. Russia funds its war effort partly through oil revenues, but increasingly through domestic bond sales and drawing down its national wealth fund, which has declined from $190 billion to approximately $55 billion. Meanwhile, the military-industrial companies supplying weapons to all parties, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Rheinmetall, and dozens of others, report record profits and rising stock prices. The profiteers of this conflict aren't on any battlefield. They're in boardrooms and bond markets, following a formula refined over 2 centuries. The mathematics of the current system points toward an inevitable conclusion. When interest payments on debt exceed the ability to service them through economic growth, 3 options exist: explicit default, which destroys creditor confidence; inflation, which quietly defaults by repaying debt with devalued currency; or austerity, which cuts government services to prioritize debt payments. History shows that major powers typically choose the second option. The United States inflated away much of its World War II debt through the 1950s and 1960s, reducing its debt to GDP ratio from 119% in 1946 to 31% by 1974, not through repayment, but through economic growth and moderate inflation that made the debt less burdensome. Today's situation differs in one critical respect. The debt growth rate now exceeds the economic growth rate. U.S. federal debt grew by $2.3 trillion in fiscal year 2023, while GDP grew by approximately $1.9 trillion nominally. This means that debt is accumulating faster than the economy's ability to service it through growth alone. The Rothschild formula, which depends on credible government repayment, faces a crisis point when governments can no longer credibly promise repayment without destroying their economies. The geopolitical implications compound the financial ones. As the United States debt finances its military dominance, potential rivals have 2 options: compete in a borrowing race they might lose, or undermine the dollar's reserve currency status that makes American borrowing uniquely affordable. China's Belt and Road Initiative, the expansion of the BRICS economic bloc, and discussions of commodity-backed trade currencies all represent attempts to create an alternative to the dollar-denominated debt system. If successful, these efforts would dramatically increase U.S. borrowing costs, potentially triggering the debt crisis that the current system has postponed. The next major conflict, whether with China over Taiwan, in the Middle East, or somewhere currently unforeseen, will likely be financed through the same formula that funded Waterloo. But the debt burden from previous conflicts may have reached a level where one more major borrowing event breaks the system's credibility. When creditors begin to doubt repayment, interest rates spike, making new borrowing even more expensive in a death spiral that has destroyed empires throughout history. Now, the Rothschild formula worked for 2 centuries because sovereign debt remained credible. Governments might struggle, but they ultimately paid their obligations. The real lesson of the Rothschild formula isn't about one family's wealth or even about war profiteering in the conventional sense. It's about understanding that modern nation-states, regardless of their political systems or ideologies, are ultimately trapped in a financial architecture that was designed to benefit creditors, regardless of which nations win or lose specific conflicts. We focus on geopolitical rivalries: China versus America, Russia versus NATO, democracy versus authoritarianism, while missing that all parties are playing a game whose rules were written by financiers 2 centuries ago. The most significant pattern isn't which side wins military confrontations, but that every confrontation increases the debt burden and strengthens the creditor class's structural control over national policy. The contrarian insight is this: the real power in the modern world doesn't belong to the nations with the largest militaries or the most advanced technology. It belongs to those who control access to credit at the sovereign level. Understanding the Rothschild formula means recognizing that war has been industrialized, not just in its weaponry, but in its financing, and that industrial-scale debt has become the most powerful peacetime weapon ever created. The question isn't whether the formula will eventually break, but what happens to global order when nations realize that the game was rigged from the start, and that the only winning move might be to stop playing entirely.